In St. Luke chapter 9, verse 31, St. Luke says that the subject of the conversation with Moses and Elias on the Mount of Transfiguration was Christ's Exodus. This is the only place in the Gospels where the word Exodus is used for death, and thus he appears to suggest that the death of Christ was the great moral and spiritual end to which the law and the prophets, represented by Moses and Elias, looked. He says that they spake of his exodus, which he should accomplish at Jerusalem. Did not the Holy Spirit thereby intend us to infer that the exodus, which was begun by Israel at the Red Sea, was accomplished by Christ at Jerusalem? Did he not intend us to bear in mind what he has taught us by St. Paul, that Christ's exodus is the substance of which Israel's exodus was the shadow, that Christ is the true Passover, 1 Corinthians 5:7. See John 19:36 with Exodus 12:46. That his passage through the Red Sea of his own blood, by which we come forth out of our spiritual Egypt, and in which our spiritual Pharaoh and his host are overwhelmed, and from which we march forward to the Canaan of our rest, was prefigured by the exodus of Israel from Egypt, and that in reading the book of Exodus, we are not only reading a true history of a past event, but have there a prophetical gospel, a typical delineation of Christ himself and of mankind summed up in him, 1 Corinthians 10:1-11, of mankind dying in his death and rising again to life in his resurrection. The Exodus was the type and figure of the greatest event which the world has ever seen. It was a preparation for an event which concerns all mankind in every nation of the earth until the end of time and through the countless ages of eternity. It was the type and figure of the world's exodus. It was a type and figure of mankind's deliverance by the death and passion of him who is no other than the Lord Jehovah himself, and who took our nature and became incarnate, and passed through the Red Sea of his own passion, and overwhelmed Satan in its abysses, and marched through that sea, and carried the world with him, and led it forth in triumph from the house of spiritual bondage, from the Egypt of Satan, sin, and death, and conducted it in a glorious career toward the Canaan of its heavenly rest. The Holy Spirit in the New Testament teaches us to regard the Exodus in this light. He teaches us that Israel, God's firstborn, was a figure of Christ, Matthew 2:15, and that all things in the Exodus of Israel were tupoi amon, figures of us, that they were figures of Christ's church, whose members are united together under him, their head, who has engrafted them into his own body, and has made them partakers of his own death and resurrection by the sacrament of baptism, which was foreshadowed by the passage of Israel through the waters of the Red Sea. Israel's exodus was Christ's exodus. It was the exodus of his church in him. Their wanderings are ours. Christ has taught us to see himself in the manna from heaven, John 6:49, and in the brazen serpent, John 3:14, lifted up by Moses in the wilderness. St. Paul has taught us to see him in the smitten rock, gushing with water in the desert. The history of the Israelites is our history. It is the history of the Church Universal. It was written for our sake, as the Holy Spirit teaches when he says by St. Paul, all these things happened unto them tupikos, so as to have a figurative meaning, and are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come.